everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today we're talking about the poetry of St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross, of course, one of the great mystics in the Church's history. Also, one of the great poets in the Spanish poetic tradition. And I've never read any of John of the Cross's books. This was my first time reading pretty much any of his poems, I think. The occasion for this episode is the publication by Wise Blood Books of a new set of translations by a contemporary poet, Rhina Espaillat. These were originally published in, I think, the pages of First Things magazine, and now they've been collected in this new book, The Spring That Feeds the Torrent, Poems by St. John of the Cross. But in addition to reading this collection, I also read an older set of translations that has been recently republished by another Catholic publisher, Clooney Media. These translations are by Roy Campbell, titled just St. John of the Cross Poems. Roy Campbell was actually sort of like a minor inkling. He was a friend of Tolkien and Lewis. He converted to Catholicism while living in Spain and was a pretty well-known poet of the time. So his poems, his translations take a different approach. It's quite interesting as well. And so we'll be talking about both of those with more emphasis probably on the newer book, the Espaillat book. So I don't know much about St. John of the Cross, as I mentioned. I also don't know Spanish. Both of these volumes, it's worth noting, have the original Spanish in them, opposite facing the English. But thankfully, I was connected with someone who can help me to discuss these poems. Carla Galdo is my guest today. She is a graduate of the John Paul II Institute. She's a student in the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, which is how I got connected with her. And she's a leader of the National Catholic Women's Book Group, Well Read Mom. Carla, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure, Thomas.
Well, before we get into St. John, I wanted to just ask you about the Well Read Mom organization, because I've heard about it a bit over the years. A friend of mine has been involved, but I actually don't know very much about it. So please tell me about this.
So I write for Well Read Mom. I produce some audio content, and there's a great team of other ladies who really are at the helm. So I'm kind of in more of a support role, but Well Read Mom, we're dedicated to kind of reinvigorating the culture of reading and contributing to a cultural conversation that has lost its grounding in books and in literature, forsaking a lot of this just for the digital interaction, social media, reading through, news feeds every day. So I would say we're more than a book discussion group. We're kind of a group that's focused on friendship, on accountability, on deepening conversations among women. And I'll just read our mission out of our Reader's Companion. This is what we produce for our groups every year across the country. This is a guide to the 9, sometimes more, books that we read. It has discussion prompts and thematic suggestions. And it's really just a support for digging into this literature that we read together. We accompany women in the reading of great books and spiritual classics to encourage personal growth, friendship, meaningful conversations, in order to explore the human condition and to reorient ourselves to what is good, beautiful, and true. And so you can hear the transcendentals in there in our mission. So I'd say we're definitely more than a book discussion group, but our focus is on great literature that explores human themes and help us deepen our friendship and our understanding of what it is to be people.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'll link to that in the description for this episode. I like the focus on moms because whenever I get a comment from a mom who listens to this podcast, it makes me very happy because I feel like the the influence is amplified when a mother is listening to the show. And to be honest, I think about my sisters who have kids and they don't always have as much time as they would like to read or pursue other interests or become more cultured or things like that. I mean, they certainly do a lot. But I think of people who maybe if somebody is pointing them in a direction or giving them just like a foothold with an interesting discussion, or even just hearing some poems, in this case, read in audio form, then that's a nice service that I can do. So I particularly value the mothers who listen to this podcast, because obviously mothers are kind of the transmitters of culture in a very fundamental way. Okay, so St. John of the Cross. Well, all right, St. John of the Cross. I think St. John of the Cross is intimidating to a lot of people. I think that, I mean, what is he is most associated with this idea of the dark night of the soul. We'll be reading the poem that is sometimes referred to by that title, and we'll have a chance to talk about some of that stuff. But maybe it would be helpful to contextualize, these poems in the context of who he was, what his life looked like.
Right. I think I agree. Just thinking about St. John of the Cross in terms of his big abstract spirituality ideas that oftentimes we can have misconceptions about it. He can seem unrelatable, but I think in looking at his biography, the thing that comes across to me the most is how much he struggled with things that are still very relevant to many people today. His childhood was pretty unstable. His mother had to move him and his siblings from city to city. They had to try and find community there. And eventually the way that he ended up doing that was by joining the Carmelites. And first he's a monk. This is in 1560s. And a couple years later, he's ordained a priest. And pretty soon after that, he comes to know St. Teresa of Avila. And this is a big deal. It's something I didn't realize until doing more research. She's older than he is. She's about 30 years older than he is. And she kind of discovers him. She sees in this man who's physically small, diminutive, a soul that's really great in God's eyes. And it would be amazing to kind of see the two of them encountering one another. But what she sees is a partner that can team up with her and the reforms that she was doing of her female Carmelite order. At that time, there was some laxity that had grown into the order, a lot of socializing, less poverty, less austerity, less prayer. And she was trying to draw her community back to this. And she saw the potential of a teammate, of someone who could do this with her. And eventually John does join up with her. But there's a price to this, just like there is a price to trying to change anything in any large organization. I'm sure many of us have witnessed this, not only in the church, but anywhere. And they both get a lot of flack for this. And John ends up suffering. He ends up actually being thrown in prison by members of his order. I believe it was members of his order for up to a year, and kind of psychologically, physically tormented, tortured. But it's here in this space of suffering where a lot of the poems are written, not all of them, but many of them. So he's in this space where, it's not that he's reached the heights of perfection and he's living at his ease and writing these poems. He wrote them on scraps of paper that people, snuck in with his food. And, then after he finally escapes from this time of imprisonment, gets to parse through them with his community, and he shares them with the female Carmelites as well. Father Ian Matthews, in this book called Impact of God, I've read a number of books on John of the Cross, and I feel like most of them have left me feeling not worthy and, just not capable of ever approaching anything like his spirituality or the depths of relationship that he had with God. But Father Ian Matthews really makes this approachable, and he breaks down John's spirituality into these 5 moments, and not necessarily chronological, but I think it's helpful to look at John in these kind of chunks of spirituality. He calls them entry, gift, space, healing, and encounter. So if you're like me and you think about, John of the Cross, maybe this is someone that could help me when I'm standing in a space of, not being sure about my life or where I'm supposed to be going. Maybe I'm not necessarily in the church. Maybe I'm just wondering, is this for me? John of the Cross is for you at that moment of entry. He kind of is a witness. He holds up this sign with his poetry, and he also has spiritual writings, but he says, follow me. I've been there. You can come this way. Not an intimidating thing, but a welcoming. And then gift. God is the giver and the seeker par excellence. We often have the thought of, the Augustine with his restless heart, and we're the ones that are, seeking God constantly, restlessly. Well, think about that and then multiply it to an infinite amount. God is the one who is seeking us, who is giving himself constantly. And it's our job to create space. That's the next moment of John's spirituality. And thinking about this creation of space, we're not saying no to the good things in the world, the good things in our life, but just saying no to kind of the spiritual clutter, emotional clutter, psychological clutter that we might be holding in our hands, just setting it aside so that we approach God with open hands, waiting for him receptively. And then healing. I think this might be a good spot to talk about the dark night of the soul, because when we talk about it, we say, oh, well, my friend is in a dark night, or I'm experiencing this moment of suffering that feels like a dark night. It's not just a moment of dryness in prayer, or a lack of consolation, or, I had a moment of conversion and now things in the spiritual life are not making sense as much as they did at that first exciting moment.
Right.
It's not just that.
Yeah.
It's got a trajectory forward. It's a space where God is holding us. And I mean, this is John. This is not my wisdom whatsoever, but God is holding us in this kind of dark womb-like space, moving us forward to an ever deeper knowledge of him. And his presence at that moment is mysterious, and sometimes it's dark and not understandable. And so that's the darkness of the dark night.
Right.
Father Matthew,
my understanding is that there's a number of nights that are spoken of too. There's not just the dark of the night of the soul. There's like the night of the senses. Are these different sort of different things that people might sort of get confused?
Right. I mean, I think you could probably parse them out, and it would probably take a while to parse them out. But there is the sense of, I guess, when you experience God in a certain way at the beginning of your life of faith, and then that changes because he's trying to draw you into a deeper space, that could be, let's say, the dark night of the senses, perhaps, because you're experiencing him differently and it's not understandable at first. Yeah.
Because the traditional, like, sort of mystical, the negative approach to spirituality, like the Dionysian approach, or whatever you might want to call it, where we sort of we lean into like the unknowableness of God. That's not the same as the dark night of the soul, but it is one aspect of the night that's described in John of the Cross's poetry. The dark night of the soul, as traditionally discussed, from my understanding, is a purgative process. But then there's another, so it's not quite the same as just sort of the sort of general mystical night, which could be, last, the whole life of somebody before they attain to the beatific vision, where they're knowing God without these sort of like special sensations or special consolations or whatever. But another thing is just spiritual suffering, spiritual desolation is not the same thing necessarily as the dark night of the soul. I mean, the example that I think of is Mother Teresa. When Saint Teresa of Calcutta it was revealed that she had these spiritual sufferings and this sense of emptiness and this lack of sense of God's existence, sort of like Saint Therese of Lisieux experienced. You heard people describing that as, oh, she had this dark night of the soul. But she herself, what I've read is that she came to believe that that's not what she was experiencing. So Mother Teresa came to believe that this was simply part of her vocation and part of her union with the sufferings of Christ, which is not the same as this purgative process, because the purgative process is really a result of a certain level of obstinacy, even if subtle obstinacy on the part of the soul, that it needs to be sort of detached from these attachments and things like that. But that's not really what Mother Teresa was experiencing. So I just think, I don't know how much it'll factor into the discussion of the poems, but it's worth mentioning because I hear people use this phrase all the time. And even though I'm certainly not an expert in anything about the mystical life or John of the Cross in particular, from what I've read, I get the impression that this term is misused or
Hmm.
misconstrued quite a bit. So I thought it was worth mentioning anyway.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's like you said, it's a purgative moment that's leading to the encounter. And in the poems that we're reading, we're going to find kind of the joy or the fruition of that encounter, which I think in terms of trying to parse through it in language is the most difficult thing, which is why he wrote poetry about it. This is
Right.
why,
Right.
the
Yeah.
inexplicable union with the divine.
Yeah. And if I can just say one other thing about the Dark Knight, I think the other misconception is this is something that everybody will experience if they're taking the path to holiness, which is not necessarily the case. I mean, if you read other saints, there's other paths that they describe that sort of explicitly rule this kind of that sort of bypass this particular kind of purgative Dark Knight. But what you were just saying about why he was writing poetry, that's very important. And the one little bit of John's prose that I did read was this, I think it was this introduction to, so basically two of his biggest spiritual poems, the Spiritual Canticle and what we might call the Dark Night of the Soul, or just the Dark Night. In each of those cases, he writes a book sort of commenting on each stanza of the poem and explaining them in spiritual terms. But there's this kind of prologue to his book on the Spiritual Canticle, which I found very, very interesting. And I'm just going to, I'm not going to quote from it, but you can find it online. So St. John said that he himself couldn't fully explain the poem because it came forth in this moment of fervor of the love of God guided by the Holy Spirit. So therefore, even as the author, because it's not just coming from him, there's aspects of it that either he can't explain or that it wouldn't necessarily be profitable to the reader to explain because the reader has to come at it with his own personal kind of gifts and what God is going to reveal to him through these lines. I thought that was very interesting, obviously on the spiritual level, but also on the poetic level, because I think what he's saying is just as true of art in a natural sense, that it's not necessarily for the artist to even completely understand or completely be able to explain his or translate his art into some other medium of words, for instance, and that it would potentially do a disservice to the work or to the experience of the beholder to do that. So I thought that was very interesting. I mean, you could write a whole essay or even book on that idea of that sort of that particular connection, one of many, between the mystical life and the experience of making or contemplating art.
Right, I would agree. I've read other anecdotes where he says, where words are born of love, it's better to leave them open. He's talking about the poem as its own statement, not
Right.
needing further explanation. And I wondered, because I know he wrote those explanations of the poems, obviously after he was out of his imprisonment. People in his Carmelite congregation and the women too, they had set the poems to music and they were singing them. So people knew these. And I think there was a hunger to know, how did you get there? Or tell me more about this, which is not it's a legitimate question, but I think he did want to lean in also to the fact that this says what it should say. I kind of envisioned, a poem that's pretty familiar to people, Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken, right? I mean, if you try to explain it to somebody, well, there's a guy, he's standing at the fork in the road, he's deciding if he goes left or right. I mean, automatically it loses almost everything at that moment. And he goes on one that's, not so well traveled. Like to take, John's poetry and do the same thing with it, all of a sudden there's this flatness, there's a loss. So it's possible to do it if someone's really confused about what's going on, or if someone really wants to parse through it or deepen it. But there's so much more power in the poetic language.
Right. And I think these poems in particular, on my first reading, I was kind of like, yeah, this is cool. But then I kind of realized I think these poems are really made to be pondered, especially reading them in translation. I'm sure that in Spanish, I mean, I know this because I don't know Spanish, but I actually took the time to read some of the poems out loud in Spanish just because I have a sort of general idea of Spanish pronunciation, at least. There is like a very sensually enjoyable aspect to the poems that, um, might be to some degree lost in translation. But I do think that you get more out of the poems. You have to meditate on them. It's sort of like the Song of Songs. You can't just sort of take it on face value necessarily. You can take it on an intuitive level. So it doesn't have to necessarily have to be analyzed totally. But I think that all that is to say, I feel like I've like barely scratched the surface. They're meant for sort of like a savoring,
Right. Well, what you said actually reminded me of an anecdote that Rhina Espaillat relates in an essay she has in one of her other books of poetry. It's called Bilingual, and it's about her experience of growing up as a bilingual poet. But she talks about how at a poetry reading, she closed the evening with a poem in Spanish. And afterwards, an English-speaking audience member approaches her and says, "Oh, I wish you had read more poems in Spanish." And Rhina Espaillat says, "Well, where did you learn Spanish?" She says, "Oh, I don't speak Spanish and I don't understand it at all. But I loved listening to the musicality of what you read. I love just listening to the words and experiencing it." So I think that speaks to what you were saying, even reading them, just knowing Spanish slightly. I think it does.
Totally. Yeah. And, John of the Cross, I've heard that, Spanish speakers consider him to have a kind of Shakespeare-like status within Spanish language literature, and particularly his poems. You mentioned to me before we recorded this that St. John Paul II there's a story that he learned Spanish earlier in his life just so he could read John of the Cross in the original Spanish. And so, I mean, I think that speaks to the extent to which it might be difficult to translate his work, and particularly his poetry, like any great poetry, but also probably to like the sensual experience and the sort of like, not to be cliche, but like the passion that is conveyed in the Spanish original, and you definitely even if you don't know Spanish, read them aloud if you have the book, because it does have this like great, like just metrical brilliance, and you can get a sense of wordplay in certain parts, just as within I forget which one of St. Thomas Aquinas' Eucharistic hymns has like all the awesome wordplay in it. But it's sometimes the poems function in a similar way with the wordplay and the sort of like just different permutations of a particular word in this same line and things like that. So, I already mentioned a little bit about Roy Campbell. Should we say anything about Espaillat before reading any of the poems?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in that essay, Bilingual, she talks about how when her family came to New York City in 1939, her father didn't actually allow anyone to speak English in the apartment. And not because of any hatred, but because he wanted to preserve the Spanish in their home. And he just had this intuition that this was the way it needed to be. And I think she talks about the friction that this caused in the family when she was a young child, and she wanted to, share what happened at school, and it all made sense to her in English. And he said, no, Spanish only, purely Spanish in the home. And now, of course, she's looking back from a space of gratitude, because this was a gift that her father gave her, to be fully bilingual and to not kind of limp along in half English and half Spanish, which, I've seen happen in a lot of immigrant communities from, first generation, second generation, can really happen. So I think she also speaks there about her desire to preserve the musicality of the language. Nims, in the introduction to The Spring That Feeds the Torrent, the Wise Blood book, says one cannot translate a poem. And he said, but you can try to reconstitute a poem by taking the thought, the imagery, the rhythm, the sound, the qualities of diction, all these things that make up the original, and then rework them into English. And for Espaillat, I think it's really worth saying that these are very important to her. She's one of the new formalist poets, kind of a group of poets in the 80s and 90s who were turning writers and readers' attention back towards traditional poetic forms, meter, rhyme, all these methods of versification that had been lost, basically, since World War II, since the increasing influence of free verse in the academy and in what, people bought and were reading in poetry. So she's particularly equipped to do these poems well. And if you look at them with attention, you'll see, I mean, down to the syllable counts. I'm pretty sure that the Spanish is more syllabic in the way that you would evaluate the meter versus the English where we're reading in iambs in feet. But she, in almost every poem, preserves every line in terms of the meter, and then the rhyme patterns she also preserves. So she's
Right.
looking at this poem as not just an item of meaning, but a whole body experience, something that has a rhythm and a sound.
I thought that it was more successful in terms of making that flow seem natural in English in some poems than others. And we're going to start with, I think, what we both agree are probably her most successful translations. So the first one we're going to talk about, right, is the Spiritual Canticle, which I already mentioned earlier. And this is definitely drawing on the Song of Songs, right? But also
Right.
incorporating kind of pastoral imagery, of the sort of like shepherd, pastoral love poetry and things like that.
Mhm.
Not that there isn't any of that in the Song of Songs itself, of course. But now I think we weren't planning on reading this in its entirety, but it's pretty long. But I'm going to let you pick the excerpts to read and talk about.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've kind of gestured towards this, but just so it's very clear as we're reading, he's writing, the main speaking voice is the bride, which would be the soul. And this is not just, a female religious or a female person. This would be any person whose soul is feminine in relation to God, who is, in John's conception, the masculine initiator, right? He is the
Right.
creator. He gives us our being. He sustains our being, and we receive that actively.
Right.
John Paul II, gesturing towards the theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, talked about this Marian principle in the church, the way that Mary, the mother of God, was actively receptive to God. This is the way that every soul is. So, some can kind of look askance on this, like, is this a question of, let's say, like gender confusion? No, it's not. It's a
Right.
theological principle about the soul's stance with regard to
Yes.
God. So applicable to men and women equally.
Totally. Yeah, that's very important. Obviously, this goes back to the Song of Songs, right? Or at least any kind of allegorical reading of it.
Right.
And this is a very ancient idea that every soul is feminine in relation to God, and that's something that's either not known by many Catholics, or maybe perhaps some people might be uncomfortable with that idea or just misunderstand it. And then on the other hand, you have people who want to sort of use that for sexual subversion. And so, I mean, I remember reading a piece a few years ago that was saying St. John of the Cross wrote homoerotic poetry, which is just a total misunderstanding of the fact that he is speaking in the narrator, the speaker in such poems is a feminine one,
Right.
and addressing the Lord, and he's speaking in this, and it's not just like this is his weird gender bending conception that he came up with because of his personal issues or something. And this is a tradition that he's entering into here.
Right.
So it's a really kind of illiterate, take on the poems to say that they're homoerotic. And then the gender bending thing, I can see why somebody might read that traditional mystical language from a modern perspective and think that that's what's going on, or think that there's some kind of room for that being made. But again, really, it's more of a metaphysical, mystical, spiritual level than it is on a bodily level, that we're talking about. Again, it's this active, in traditional language would have been said like active, passive. Now we prefer to use the word of receptive or active receptivity, because it curtails certain possible misunderstandings of the word passive. But yeah, so that is a very important point, and perhaps will help people both forestall any kind of nasty interpretations of the poems, but also help people who might not understand what's going on to sort of get accustomed to it. I think this is something we just have to get comfortable with in the spiritual life, or else we're not going to understand the nature, the relationship between Christ and the church, for instance. I mean, this receptivity is very important to understanding what the church is and what the obligations of the church are with regard to receiving what it's being given from God, just to even bring it beyond the individual level. So very, very important, profound concept. Obviously, factors into not just the Song of Songs, but St. Paul in Ephesians 5 and all other sorts of places.
Right, Hosea too. I think when we're talking about this, I mean,
totally,
there's always the temptation to overly spiritualize it. So I always try to remind myself, right, I am a body soul, right? And all of these experiences that I'm having in my body soul are gestures towards my need for God, right? And so any human experience that I have in this body soul is good in the way that it is indicative of that desire for God. So I think that's why I love reading these poems from John. It's kind of this delicate dance. We don't want to just push away the experience of the body and say, this is completely allegorical and it's just a mystical, we're talking about only spiritual things, right? Well, no,
because he's using the bodily language
right.
to connect you with those things. Yeah.
So I think it's a dance, and there's always ways that we can express it better or worse, but yeah, right. I think it's a consolation to remember that, just in the way that the sacraments engage us as whole persons, as whole bodies, right? Christ's body is literally given over for us, and in baptism, right? The water literally has to touch our physicality, right? That this is, an expression of the beauty of the flesh. So.
Right.
And the union of the spirit and the flesh. So, okay, the spiritual canticle of the soul and the bridegroom Christ. I'm going to try to read some excerpts that kind of illustrate the flow of the poem. So I'll pause and reorient as I read, just so we know where we are in this long poem. One thing to maybe listen for, if you don't have the poem in front of you, is the A, B, A, B, B rhyme scheme, which Espaillat has preserved from the Spanish. And also kind of the shorter and longer lines, again, beautifully preserved from John of the Cross's original. So the musicality of this, the way that it will just enchant you as it sets the scene of the bride's search from the bridegroom, is very beautifully replicated from the Spanish into the English. The first several stanzas are in the voice of the bride, who is wildly searching for the bridegroom. Where have you fled and vanished, beloved, since you left me here to moan? Deer-like you leapt, then banished, and wounded by my own, I followed you with cries, but you had flown. Shepherds, if you discover, going about this knoll to tend your sheep, the dwelling of that lover whose memory I keep, tell him I sicken unto death and weep. To seek him I shall scour these trackless woods to where the rivers flow, not stop to pick a flower, not run from beasts, but go past every fort and border that I know. O forests darkly glooming, seated by my beloved's very hand, O pasture richly blooming, you flower-jeweled band, I beg you, say if he has crossed your land. This next pair of stanzas, the bride is talking about Christ not only as the bridegroom, but as these beguiling scenes in nature. My lover is the highlands. He is the wooded valleys, lone and deep, the far mysterious islands, the streams that sing and leap, whispering winds that court the fields they sweep. The night whose stillness pleases, and ushers morning and the rising sun. Silence whose music eases, music from silence spun, and supper that delights when day is done. And then we get the voice of the bridegroom who responds to the bride, finally, and she's still searching. So this is a voice speaking to her a little bit at a distance, and then you'll see the union. Birds who fly hither lightly, you lions, fawns, and leaping fallow deer, woods, vales, and rivers sprightly, winds, waters, heats that sear, and terrors that surround the night with fear. By lyres and their soft sighing, I do beseech you by the siren's song, silence your angry crying. Halt where the walls rise strong to keep the sleeping bride secure from wrong. The bride has come to rest in the pleasant garden's most alluring space, and at her ease to nest in her quiet leaning place within the sweetness of the groom's embrace. Under the apple boughs, there did I take you when our troth was plighted, there gave my hand and vows, and there you were requited, where once your mother was abased and slighted. And here's a pair of stanzas that again shows the moment of union, like the end of those last couple. We shall weave emeralds, flowers picked when the earliest rays of morning shine, garlands grown by the powers of your own love to twine about a single strand, a hair of mine. One hair you chanced to note about my neck that did your glance awaken. You glimpsed it at my throat, were snared and shaken, wounded by my eye, and wholly taken. And then finally, the close of the poem. Let us find joy together, beloved. In your beauty find our looks reflected, whether on hills or in pure brooks. Let us go deep into those wooded nooks. Then to high hidden crevices in stony desert waste, caves none can find unbidden. We'll go, untraced, where pomegranate wine is ours to taste. You would delight me, showing me there those things my spirit yearns to know, and later by bestowing, oh love I treasure so, what first you gave me some days ago. Air in its even breathing, the song sweet Philomel sings in her flight, the grove its peace bequeathing to gentle night, with flames consuming all in painless light. And none to apprehend it, Aminadab quite gone without a trace, the siege quietly ended, horsemen halting their race, dismounting near the waters of that place. Well, one of the things that I think this poem does so well is enchant. And Dana Gioia, who's another one of these new formalist poets, talks about poetry as enchantment. And that's what we talked about already, just the musicality and the sound of it. It kind of weaves a spell that brings you into a space that's more than just the words combined. And so I think what John does and what Espaillat very faithfully transmits is gives us all of these sensual details, right? We have the trackless woods where the rivers flow. We have the sensual details of nature. And then he's also so attentive to the sensual details of the body, right? I love the two stanzas that I read that are focused on just the one strand of hair that's around her neck, like a golden necklace almost. And it delights the bridegroom to such an extent that he's wounded, right? He's wounded with delight. And I loved that note, right? Because there's so many layers. The bride is delighting in the bridegroom's delight in her. And I thought this actually spoke to an experience that I feel like I had in my moment of reversion, but also that I've heard others speak to, that when in moments of really desolation or darkness or feeling alone, in the world, or friends abandoning you, what turns your heart more deeply towards God is this knowledge that he delights in me as I am, and he wants to draw me, towards himself. But this delight. So I love the way that he evoked that with this tiniest of physical details, with the golden necklace of hair. Well, the other thing that I find really delightful about this poem is when the bride compares the bridegroom, to all of these different things in nature. I felt like this was perhaps the most contemporary feeling set of stanzas. My lover is the highlands, he is the wooded valleys. He's compared to the highlands, the valleys, islands, streams, the night, and then supper. Kind of just this pleasant, gentle satisfaction that one can have, this at-homeness of being with one's, at home.
Can you read that stanza, the supper stanza again? It's such a great bit.
It's those two pairs. My lover is the highlands, he is the wooded valleys lone and deep. The far mysterious islands, the streams that sing and leap, whispering winds that court the fields they sweep, the night whose stillness pleases and ushers morning and the rising sun, silence whose music eases, music from silence spun, and supper that delights when day is done. I think
that's
it's
just
the
such a
litany of
pleasing.
images that I love
Yeah.
because Christ is not only the silence, he's the music, and he's not only the highlands or mysterious islands, but he's supper. Like he's the very most basic things that nourish us.
Right.
So
we're going to talk also about what is it called? The Dark Knight in this Espaillat translation. And this is where we're at some point going to bring in Roy Campbell a little bit and compare some of the translation choices. I think the title is worth mentioning, right? Because the titles many of the titles in this Espaillat volume, The Spring That Feeds the Torrent, are different from the titles of the corresponding poems in the Roy Campbell translations. Well, first it's interesting because in the Spanish, in the Espaillat volume, it says en una noche oscura, and then it translates that as Dark Night of the Soul, but the Spanish title actually goes on. It says Canción de la Subida del Monte Carmel. So there is a reference to Mount Carmel that's not even translated in the title. But then the title for the one in the Campbell book is totally different. So this is Songs of the Soul in Rapture at Having Arrived at the Height of Perfection, which is union with God by the road of spiritual negation. So we already talked about this idea of the Dark Night being a path that goes somewhere. But in this case, the Dark Night of the Soul might be somewhat of a confusing title to people who don't understand the concept, because this poem, it is about a dark night. It is about walking without an exterior light and things like that, but it's not, there's nothing particularly unhappy about this poem, so it's really not very anguished or tortured or anything like that you might expect. Even the parts where the speaker has not arrived yet are really not, they're just kind of calm and
it's anticipation, right?
Yeah.
I would agree. I think when I noticed that choice to eliminate kind of the expansive title, and I could see how it gives a more contemporary feel to the poetry of Espaillat, right? The Dark Night of the Soul, and then you just move into the poetry and let the poem speak itself.
Right.
So this is just an artistic choice, I would say.
Right.
I do like the Campbell title because it gives me an entry into the theological meaning that I didn't have to hold on to with the Espaillat. But I think that one could arrive at, having read the poem a couple times and being a little bit more familiar with John of the Cross. But so I'm not sure if I would have made that choice necessarily, but I definitely see the kind of the cleaner, more contemporary feel that's distinct from, it's almost a commentary in and of itself, that title that Campbell includes. Right. So, and one might not want that necessarily.
Okay, go ahead with the Spanish then.
Okay. So, en una noche oscura, canción de la subida del Monte Carmel. En una noche oscura, con ansias en amores inflamada, oh dichosa ventura, salí sin ser notada, estando ya mi casa sosegada. A oscuras y segura, por la secreta escala disfrazada, oh dichosa ventura. A oscuras y encelada, estando ya mi casa sosegada. En la noche dichosa, en secreto, que nadie me veía, ni yo miraba cosa sin otra luz y guía, sino la que en el corazón ardía. Aquesta me guiaba, más cierto que la luz del mediodía, a donde me esperaba, quien yo bien me sabía, en sitio donde nadie aparecía. Oh noche que guiaste, oh noche amable más que la alborada, oh noche que juntaste amado con amada, amada en el amado transformada. En mi pecho florido, que entero para él solo se guardaba, allí quedó dormido y yo le regalaba, y el ventalle de cedros aire daba. El aire de la almena, cuando yo sus cabellos esparcía, con su mano serena, y en mi cuello hería y todos mis sentidos suspendía. Quedéme y olvidéme, el rostro recliné sobre el amado. Cesó todo y dejéme, dejando mi cuidado entre las azucenas olvidado.
Thank you. Awesome.
And in English?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The Dark Night of the Soul. When darkest night I went, aflame with love's devouring, eager burning, O delirious event, no witnesses discerning the house now still from which my steps were turning. Hidden by darkness, bent on flight, disguised, down secret steps sojourning, O delirious event, hidden by dark and yearning, the house now still from which my steps were turning. In that most blissful night, in secrecy, since none had seen my going, nor did I pause for sight, nor had I light, for showing the route, but that which in my heart was glowing. This only did the guiding, surer than the blaze when noonday shone, to where he was abiding, who was to me well known, where we would be together and alone. O night that led me true, O night more fair than morning's earliest shining, O night that wrought from two, lover, beloved entwining, beloved and lover one in their combining. On my new flowered breast, to him alone and wholly sanctified, he leaned and lay at rest. His pleasure was my guide, and cedars to the wind their scent supplied. Down from the tower breezes came, while soft fingers winnowed through his hair. A touch that wounds and pleases caressed my throat with air, leaving every sense suspended there. I stayed, all else forgetting, inclined toward the beloved, face to face, all motion halted, letting care vanish with no trace, forgotten in the lilies of that place.
Yeah, sort of a similar ending to the spiritual canticle.
Right. I have to say I like this ending better. I mean, I think those are some of my favorite lines also in the whole book of poetry. With care vanishing with no trace, forgotten in the lilies of that place. So well done.
So yeah, on the whole, very good. There's some parts I think that work better in the Campbell translation, and some parts that work better in the Espaillat translation for this one. I think that I definitely prefer Espaillat's beginning. I mean, she's one darkest night I went. Campbell gives us upon a gloomy night, which really I feel like it really like it tilts too far in one direction. Dark is, people might have associations with it, but dark is really just a description. It's an objective description. Whatever you want may project onto it emotionally. Gloomy is too tilted in this kind of like negative, direction. I just don't think that it really captures the spiritual meaning very well. And yeah, so so Campbell's first stanza is, upon a gloomy night, with all my cares to loving ardors flushed, O venture of delight, with nobody in sight, I went abroad when all my house was hushed. I don't know otherwise than the first line if I prefer one to the other. There was a repeating line in the first two stanzas, O dichosa ventura, which Espaillat gives the same in both. She says, "O delirious event" in both, and Campbell, to do different rhyming things, in the first stanza he gives it as "O venture of delight." Second, "O happy enterprise." I think it's better if you translate it the same way both times. "O delirious event" is to me kind of like a bold choice, you know. I don't know what I really have no idea what is more faithful to the Spanish, "O venture of delight" or "O delirious event." But again, delirious is definitely a particular kind of delight, that she's choosing. And I don't know if the original Spanish is more neutral or what.
Right. I mean, I think this is a great time to talk about how words can be so multivalent and they can slide in one direction or the other, right? You mentioned gloomy. And right, I guess we could get kind of the foggy idea, but it really kind of, you almost see a body that's almost turned downwards into itself, versus the dark, like you said, it's just kind of a clear descriptive word. As far as O dichosa ventura, I feel like actually Campbell's O Venture of Delight maybe gives the more kind of, it seems almost more staid exclamation that I feel like
Right.
perhaps John gave. But I do like that Espaillat has remained faithful to the repetition of words, because it's almost like the same note in music ringing twice. She's faithful to that dynamic of the poem, whereas Campbell is more loose with that. And you lose that resonance from those two lines.
There's definitely one where, on the whole, in terms of wordplay and literal translation, I think Espaillat has the advantage here. So we read this stanza, O night that led me true, O night more fair than morning's earliest shining, O night that wrought from two, lover, beloved entwining, beloved and lover one in their combining. And Campbell gives this as, O night that was my guide, O darkness dearer than the morning's pride. I mean, that I do like that second line, actually. O night that joined the lover to the beloved bride, transfiguring them each into the other. I do think I like that Espaillat, again, repeats night 3 times, but the thing where I really feel she has the advantage is the last the last 2 lines, lover, beloved, entwining, beloved, and lover one, and they're combining. When I look at the Spanish, it looks a lot closer to the wordplay or sort of repetition of sounds that John is doing, whereas Campbell has it to the beloved bride, transfiguring them each into the other. It just really loses a lot of the fun, of those 2 lines.
Yeah,
I think
Campbell's sounds a lot more explainy, right? I mean, even visually, you can see the cross of the word lover and lover, beloved, beloved is the same kind of cruciform movement in the lines, amado, amada, amada, amado. And then, of course, the Spanish has the advantage that you have transformada.
Same sound. Yeah.
But Espaillat managed to render it relatively close, even kind of with the syntax visually looking the same. But you can hear it too, kind of that repetition, which you get 5 with the ada sound in Spanish and 4 of the lover beloved sound repeated in English.
Yeah, I'm noticing that the rhyme scheme is actually different in the Campbell translation from the original Spanish as well.
Right.
But then I really think I like the last 2. I like the final stanza of each of them quite well. But I think
which probably speaks to the strength of John's writing.
Right.
I was going to say it probably speaks to the strength of the poem itself. So yeah.
Right. So, but the penultimate 2 stanzas, I think that Campbell here does a better job, partially just in terms of clarity. So I'll read the Espaillat again. On my new flowered breast, to him alone and wholly sanctified, he leaned and lay at rest. His pleasure was my guide, and cedars to the wind their scent supplied. Campbell has, within my flowering breast, which only for himself entire I save, he sank into his rest, and all my gifts I gave, lulled by the airs with which the cedars wave. So, first of all, just on a literal level, there's more clarity what's going on with these cedars, what's the relationship between the cedars and the previous line. Now, maybe Espaillat is more faithful to John there, I don't know. But then we've got the word pleasure here. His pleasure was my guide. And there's a couple of uses in this collection by Espaillat of pleasure in this sort of like intimate context. And, look, the poems are about, on a literal level, they are about a male and female lover, joining together. And so it wouldn't be right to kind of be overly finicky about any kind of reference to that sort of thing. I mean, we shouldn't try to be more chaste than the Song of Songs, so to speak. His pleasure was my guide. Okay, I could go either way on that one. There's another translation in this book, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's a line where the word pleasure comes up again, this time used as a verb. So the line is, "With what rare lover's skill have I been pleasured?" And in that case, I did feel like she kind of went over the line into kind of, yes, this technique, almost this, sexual technique or something like that. I think that the use of pleasure as a verb is first of all, it sounds very modern. Secondly, it sounds very vulgar. It makes me think of, a disreputable shop in Greenwich Village or something. You know what I mean? Yes, they're reputable now, but to my eyes, disreputable. So yes, the use of pleasure as a verb, it just strikes me as, I don't know if, what her intent was, but it just strikes me as tonally off for what these poems are about. And also just the use of the noun pleasure as a verb. It's overly kind of modern neologism or something. And I think, worth mentioning Espaillat, to my understanding, I don't know if she was baptized Catholic. She's not a practicing Catholic. And maybe there's maybe a greater sensitivity that a Catholic writer would have had for that sort of thing. I mean, but in the
Right.
Campbell translation, go ahead.
Well, I was going to just talk about the songs of the soul and intimate, amorous communion with God. And that's where the line, with what rare lover's skill I have been pleasured, that's where that line comes from.
Right.
In Spanish, the line is, "Cuán delicadamente me enamoras." So something that means mostly something like, "You make me fall in love with you so delicately." So I can see kind of two sides of this, right? I think I would agree with the resonance of the word pleasure, especially for a contemporary English speaker. And there's a loss of the sense of delicacy, and the word is falling in love, right? There's a wholeness of what this amorous communion, this physical union of the bride and bridegroom is about. And it does kind of jump to this more surface level rather than the meta picture of what the union is all about. At the same time, I think that poem in particular is the one kind of, I think even more than the spiritual canticle, in the intensity of the physical, bridal union between bride and bridegroom is evoked. So if you're looking at the whole scheme of the poem, perhaps, an English speaker does need to be moved more into that like literal physical detail, but there is a bit of a loss, I think. So it's
I'm
these
okay
translation choices which are difficult.
Yeah.
I'm
okay with the use of the word pleasure as we have in The Dark Night of the Soul. I just think the use of it as a verb just doesn't come off right. Now, in this other poem, the line we're discussing in the Campbell, he says, "So daintily in love you make me fall," which I also don't particularly like, because the word dainty doesn't really... can you fall in love daintily? I'm really not sure if that's even possible. So I
feels
don't
like
think we're supposed to have
into love,
a dainty love for God, But so back to the Dark Night, though. So the second to last stanza, I think, is really just quite confusing in the Espaillat translation. So, "Down from the tower breezes came, while soft fingers winnowed through his hair. A touch that wounds and pleases caressed my throat with air, leaving every sense suspended there." Okay, what are these fingers? Are these the bride's fingers? Are these the metaphorical fingers of the wind? The touch caressed her throat with air, so is it just the touch of the breezes? The Spanish says mano, and here's the Campbell translation of that stanza. Over the ramparts fanned, while the fresh wind was fluttering his tresses, with his serenest hand my neck he wounded, and suspended every sense with its caresses. Just much clearer on a literal level in the Campbell translation.
Right. I mean, I think this stanza, which I did look up in multiple translations, I think it's particularly difficult to kind of parse out what John is even saying, like whose fingers are winding through the hair. Is it the breezes?
Right.
And then the hand. The one change that I noticed that Espaillat did was change cuello, which is normally, I think to my understanding, referring to neck rather than throat. So the exteriority rather than the interiority. So there's this kind of change where it's the air, the inward breathing of the air from the tower, perhaps that's caressing the throat, as opposed to the hand of her beloved.
Right. Yeah, but the Spanish does have hand, and Espaillat doesn't translate that.
Right.
It's interesting to compare these and look at some of the translation choices with that one in particular. And I think that I don't know if there's one that I prefer over the other. I think on the whole I might prefer the Espaillat, but there's a couple parts where it's less clear than the Campbell.
Yeah.
So what are we doing next?
Okay, so this is glossa apart and not yet a part.
From the Espaillat, yeah.
From the Espaillat. Apart and not yet apart, I live lightless and unseeing, to be consumed out of being. My soul hungers for release from all earthly things created, and above itself elated, would live in delightful peace, all but God repudiated. Let them say it as they may, most joyful news to my heart, that my soul has turned away, apart and not yet a part. Although mist obscures my sight, mortality seems nocturnal darkness, but not infernal, since although I lack for light, I've been given life eternal. The love of a life so prized, blind love toward its object fleeing, keeps my soul so mesmerized, I live lightless and unseeing. For love such wonders has wrought, since our friendship came to be, that good and evil in me have his flavor, leaving naught in my soul that is not he. So that his flame, as it travels through me, gladly rushes, freeing all that it finds, which unravels to be consumed out of being.
Before we talk about the meaning, what do you think about the flow of the meters in English with this one? Do you think it works well?
So she's replicated the rhyme scheme in Spanish, which is A, B, B, and then it changes. We've got C, D, D, C, D, and then an E, A, E, A. So because the rhyme is a little bit more disjointed in the Spanish, I think it loses some of that naturalness and some of the flow, which is interesting given the theme of the poem, right? There's a sense of the apartness, the distance that the soul is feeling from God. And so there is this disjointed sense, like it's not the same elegant flow like the river flowing in the first spiritual canticle. So I think the rhyme scheme really is what's making it sound more disjointed. One thing that I thought was interesting about this poem is, again, the weight that single word choices can have when you're moving from Spanish to English. And in particular, the title and then a couple of the other lines, I think, just illustrate the challenge of moving meaning from one language to the other. In Spanish, it's sin arrimo y con arrimo, which as far as I can understand means without support or without shelter, without protection, and with support, shelter, protection. Right. There's a simultaneity there in the Spanish, which when it's moved to English, and I think she's wanting to maintain the repetition of the word sound. So we've got the apart repetition. But it turns out that it's two expressions of separation, apart and still not yet a part. There is anticipation in that not yet, but it's two expressions of separation that's then heightened because the first line repeats it, apart and not yet a part.
That's a
Whereas,
really good point, because yet, I mean, yeah, now that you point it out, it seems redundant in a way.
and the Spanish, you've got, it's kind of that sense of the dark womb-like night, right? I feel separate, and yet I know intellectually, and maybe some part of my senses do know that I am supported by the Creator, by God. He is still present,
Right.
even in this, feeling that I have of being not supported. And so that meaning is essentially lost in that line.
Yeah.
So, and then the another repeated line is todo me voy consumiendo. It's at the end of the first stanza and at the end of the last stanza. And Espaillat renders it to be consumed out of being. And again, to be consumed out of being, the same line twice. And anytime the word being is invoked, I think my antennas go up like, what are we saying about being, right? Because God is the great I am. He is being with a capital B that is supporting all, constantly creating all of us, right? And so when I read this, I felt a little bit of a twinge of kind of like maybe an Eastern sense of escape into nothingness, escape from cycles of reincarnation. Like that was kind of the feel that this line gave me, rather than what I think the Spanish is trying to get us towards, the consuming, refining fire that's purifying all the dross in our soul and, getting us closer to being itself, not escaping from it, right? We want to remove all of the barriers that we have to being, to beatitude.
Right.
So even if that wasn't, the intended meaning, as an English speaker, a contemporary English speaker, that's where my mind starts going when I read those lines. And I think that's slightly a different direction than John would want us to be going.
Right. So in the Campbell translation, which is titled With a Divine Intention, the first stanza goes, without support, yet well supported, though in pitch darkness, with no ray, entirely I am burned away. So the emphasis on what's being burned away is not being, but I. And of course, in this sense, literally, this is also not the case, but it's it's more, it's a paradoxical, negation, obviously, in the Christian tradition. But so she says, apart and not yet apart, I live lightless and unseeing, to be consumed out of being. So all three of those lines are negative in her case, and there's no real paradox, and there's no real kind of juxtaposition where he says, without support, yet well supported, though in pitch darkness with no ray, entirely I am burned away. So well supported is being contrasted with though in pitch darkness with no ray, entirely I am burned away. And there's really not any kind of that those oppositions aren't even really present in her, in Espaillat's first stanza. Although later on in the last stanza of Campbell's translation, he does say, which now I feel in me completely reduce my being. So he does talk about reducing being there. I don't know if that's in the Spanish or not, but
no, it's not.
Interesting. Isn't that interesting? Huh. So they both do that a little bit, I guess. Okay, can we move on to El Pastorcico? So this is a pastoral, more in the pastoral love poetry tradition, very popular in the Renaissance, I guess, across nationalities.
Right. And one thing that's interesting about the voice of El Pastorcico is that the shepherd, who is Christ in this case, is weeping and wandering kind of through this pastoral scene, just like the bride was doing in the spiritual canticle, but now it's he who's searching, kind of at a loss and for his beloved. So I like kind of the switching of the protagonist in the search in this poem.
This is the Espaillat translation.
The youthful shepherd. A youthful shepherd, wandering and feeling far from his heart's content, goes sad and lonely, his thoughts on one he loves, and for her only, his breast pierced by love's wound, deep and unhealing. He weeps, not for the blows that love keeps dealing. No, he has no regrets for the affliction that tears him so. He weeps for his eviction from her remembrance. How his heart is reeling to know that she forgets him who is kneeling before her. Just to think she has refused him sends him afar, where strangers have abused him, his breast pierced by love's wound, deep and unhealing. He cries, unlucky she, forever steeling herself against my love, she who retires when I approach, frustrating my desires, my breast pierced by love's wound, deep and unhealing. See him there where at last, himself revealing, on a tree's branches, by fair arms extended, he clings aloft, although his life has ended, his breast pierced by love's wound, deep and unhealing.
Great. Yeah, this is very familiar to me. This idea for the poem. I mean, there's a medieval poem that I wish I could remember. Is it Quia amore langueo? My soul languishes for love, something like that. It's also got a repeated final line, if I'm remembering correctly, and it's this guy sort of searching high and low, and it ends with this kind of like it's this appeal made to the beloved from this guy who turns out to be Christ on the cross, basically. So it's very similar.
I feel like it takes the Good Shepherd imagery, but it takes it to another level, right? I mean, we're not just following the good shepherd, but this is one who's pierced to the marrow of his being, and he's sorrowing for the beloved who doesn't return his affection, and not only that, but it's like forgetting that he even exists. So it's
but also combined with the pastoral, the shepherd's love song, which obviously goes back to classical pagan poetry. So quite interesting combination of like three kind of different motifs, you might say. This. It's interesting to look at the way that Espaillat and Campbell deal with lines here. And I'm not going to read the whole Campbell translation. But one thing that I've noticed, more often her lines are less self-contained conceptually than his are. Let's see. To read, he weeps, this is Espaillat, he weeps not for the blows that love keeps dealing. And I'm going to do line pauses so people can tell where the lines are. No, he has no regrets for the affliction that tears him so. He weeps for his eviction from her remembrance. How his heart is reeling, new stanza, to know that she forgets him who is kneeling before her. Just to think she has refused him, sends him afar where strangers have abused him. His breast pierced by love's wound, deep and unhealing. Whereas, just to read those, I think those are the second and third stanzas. I'll read those in Campbell. He did not weep that love had pierced him so, nor with self-pity that the shaft was shot. Though deep into his heart had sunk the blow, it grieved him more that he had been forgot. Only to think that he had been forgotten by his sweet shepherdess with travail sore, he let his foes in foreign lands begotten gash the poor breast that love had gashed before. In Espaillat, you're more likely to find a new thought beginning, or a new clause beginning in the middle of the line. And I don't know, when looking at the Spanish, it doesn't look like, it looks like there's a lot of like commas at the end of lines and things like that in the Spanish. So I don't know which one is more faithful, but I think that at the very, I don't know which one is more faithful, but I think that in Campbell's translations in general, there tends to be a greater kind of like I said, self-contained aspect to each line.
It can give it kind of more
something more memorable,
a sing-songy feel a little bit, right? I mean, something that is more like this pastoral song that you might be used to hearing.
Right.
Also, what Campbell does in this poem, though, which I think we've seen now in several of his poems, the repeated line that's repeated almost word for word in Spanish, he changes very dramatically.
Yes, he does. That's true.
So the end of the first stanza, he says, because his breast by love was sorely torn. In Spanish, it's almost completely repeated, and Espaillat preserves this, but he changes it to gash the poor breast that love had gashed before.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I mean, he has a lot more latitude to work with, I would say, to make his rhymes work and to make his lines self-contained if he is going to be more free with the way that the Spanish original was.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. And, thinking of, I referenced this medieval poem. If you look at some of those, I think they're called macaronic verse, where it's a mix of languages, and often the last line of the poem is a refrain in Latin, sometimes taken from like the Divine Office or Scripture. That's another way of handling it easily, is like not to have to translate it, because it's just the same line in Latin, and the rest of the poem is freely composed.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay. So that's interesting. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this El Pastorcico poem?
Well, just, on a note that the way that John's songs were sung and put to music in his own time, if people go look up, I think his name is Paco Ibanez. He's a Spanish guitarist who, I'm not sure if he even wrote any of his own lyrics. He put many famous Spanish poems to song. And this was just kind of a personal note. I knew this as a song from my time living in Spain, and I didn't even realize it was a John of the Cross poem, but it was something that I listened to on, I believe it was a Discman that I carried around in my purse when I was in Spain, listening to this over and over again. So just reading these words, I think I had this heightened feeling of poetry as enchantment, as this movement of nostalgia and memory, into a space that I remembered, and I could almost like taste and smell the streets of Madrid. And I wanted to just share that Espaillat has this kind of affection for these poems because her father would recite the John of the Cross poems from memory, or maybe her family members as well, but I think it was her father. So she has this nostalgic affection for this poetry that's, woven in with her experience of family and memory. It kind of deepens the translator's desire, I think, to be faithful to the Spanish original, and changes the approach. So those are two notes on El Pastorcico.
So the last poem we're going to do here is one that I'm going to read. And this one is only in the Roy Campbell translation. So it is worth noting for people deciding which or both they're going to get. The Roy Campbell translation does have more of St. John's poems, mostly the same ones in each volume, but the main additions in this Roy Campbell book are this series of 9 romances. It's really just, I think, continuous parts of the same poem, I think, because it kind of continues the story. I mean, some of them, begin with then, as though, continuing from the previous one. But the one we're going to read is Romance 7, which deals with the incarnation. But also worth mentioning, at the beginning, he starts with Romance 1 with this really beautiful description of the inner life of the Trinity, getting very, sort of precisely theological with it, and talking about the nature and the persons and all of these different things. So these are really well worth reading. And the romances were actually my favorite of John's poems that I read preparing for this podcast. I do like the Spiritual Canticle and the Dark Night, but to some extent, maybe because it's just where I'm at in my life, it felt like reading about somebody else's experiences, to a certain extent. Whereas these romances are, and most of John's poems are dealing with that sort of the personal experience of the mystic to one extent or another. These romances are where he starts talking about, maybe you might say, theology or salvation history and God in a more, in a very beautiful poetic way, but in a more sort of objective way. So it's not so much about the poet's experience or the soul's experience as it is from God's perspective. And these were the ones that I enjoyed the most and sort of like resonated with the most, was most moved by. So Romance 7, as I said, deals with the incarnation. And in a previous poem, we see the father saying that because of his love for the son, he wants to give the son this bride, which is, you might say, is the human race or the church. And so this is continuing that. Now that the time was truly come, the ancient order to revoke and pay the ransom of the bride, serving in so hard a yoke, under that former law which Moses of old upon her shoulders laid. The Father in his love most tender to the Son his thought displayed. You see how your beloved bride after your image has been made. In what she most resembles you, her loveliness I have arrayed. Though differing from you by that flesh your finer nature never knew, there is in every perfect love a law to be accomplished too, that the lover should resemble the beloved and be the same, and the greater is the likeness, brighter will the rapture flame. That which to your own beloved greater rapture would provide would be to behold that likeness in the flesh with her allied. The Son then answered to the Father, My will is yours and yours alone, and the glory that I shine with is my will to work your own. That which your grace says, O my Father, in everything appears the best, since most clearly in this manner can your kindness be professed. Thus your omnipotence and justice and wisdom will be well descried. I will tell it to the world, and spread the tidings far and wide of your beauty, power, and sweetness in one sovereignty allied. I will go now and seek my bride, and take upon my shoulders strong the cares, the weariness, and labors which she has suffered for so long. And that she may win new life, I myself for her will die, rescue her from the burning lake, and bear her back to you on high. So yeah, very different from these other poems, which pretty much always have a first person subject. In this case, we get dialogue in the first person, but the poem itself is just from an objective kind of standpoint.
Right. I like kind of the heavenly space that we're introduced into with this, and the voice of the Father and the Son, which is so distinct from the other poems that we've read.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this idea of the preordained, nature of salvation history, and also the idea of why would, the love between the members of the Trinity, I think, is the persons of the Trinity is really well conveyed in a number of these romances. And it's helpful because, we often talk about Jesus becoming incarnate out of love for us. That is true. We also talk about all of these things being done for the glory of God, even for the glory of God the Father. That is true. The Son wishing to glorify the Father. Jesus, of course, speaks about this a lot, especially in the Gospel of John. But to see it in like intra-Trinitarian terms, to see the relationship and the gifts being given, not only of their own being and self to each other within the Trinity, but also the idea that the Father, out of love for the Son, wishes to give him this bride. And then the Son wishes to have everything sort of redound to the glory of the Father, so that people will be able to see who his Father is. Of course, very faithful to Scripture there, but it just is a great insight and a great fleshing out of these themes that are kind of in theology, in Scripture, in various places, but put in this, for lack of a better word, this romantic, in the broad sense of that word, style.
Right. Maybe we should read some of these on Trinity Sunday instead of hearing the Trinity is a mystery homily again.
Right. Totally.
I think what draws me the most about these are the little details that are just very specific physical details, like the last two stanzas of this Romance 7. I will now go and seek my bride and take upon my shoulders strong the cares, the weariness, and labors which she has suffered for so long. I mean, it's a little fleshing out of taking the yoke upon his shoulders, but
right, or the cross.
The literal shoulders, and then we don't have a line about saving her from sin or purifying. It's rescue her from the burning lake, and that puts an image in our mind and in our eyes, and it's a physical image that we can imagine, and makes the rescue all the more dramatic or poignant.
But also we see these insights that come from this this mystical experience of John of the Cross, the psychological and spiritual dynamics of love, where he says, there is in every perfect love a law to be accomplished too, that the lover should resemble the beloved and be the same, and the greater is the likeness, brighter will the rapture flame. So, I mean, there is this understanding of spiritual seduction, you might put it, or just spiritual gift. I mean, to want to give delight to the beloved. And so certainly you see aspects of the more personal mystical poetry, and his experience bearing fruit in this understanding, because obviously the whole point is to conform us to the life of the Trinity. So one would hope that, that one's personal mystical experience would give one a better understanding of what it's like between the Father and the Son.
Right.
So yeah, very, very cool. All right. Well, any closing remarks here before we wrap up?
I guess I would just encourage people to try the poetry of John of the Cross. One of the things that I love about poetry is that, scripture can become so familiar just from hearing it and reading it throughout our lives that we can read it but not read it, and experience it but not experience it, and can take this kind of deep level of attention to really focus ourselves, like in moments of prayer, on the Psalms or the scriptures. Maybe this is just me, but I have this experience. And when I turn to a poem, especially one that's on a spiritual matter, sometimes it's just like this huge fissure opening in the earth of my experience. And I think, yes, thank goodness that was articulated that way, because I've never heard it like that before in scripture, but it's so true. Or I want to aim for that, or I want to go for that. Just the newness of the language can be something that can open our hearts in a new way. So I've experienced that just reading these John of the Cross poems, and with other poets too. But I would say, go for it, even if it seems like it's something that's out of your realm, because sometimes the newness can just shake things up enough for beauty to just kind of erupt in your world.
Great. Yes. Well put. Good exhortation. Well, Carla, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was great to meet you.
It was my pleasure, Thomas.
Well, so everybody, I'll link to both of these collections, the Espaillat from Wise Blood Books, The Spring That Feeds the Torrent, and the Campbell translations republished by Clooney Media, and also to the Well Read Moms website, so you can check that out if you're interested. Carla, is there anywhere I should, direct people to your own writing?
I've written in Humanum, which is the online journal from the John Paul II Institute, quite a bit. I just had, for the first time, an article on Front Porch Republic. And for the Knights of Columbus magazine, Columbia, I've written a couple articles too. So those are all floating around online, but I don't have one specific webpage.
Yeah, just Google Carla Galdo. All right, everybody, thanks for listening. If you'd like to check out more of CatholicCulture.org's resources, that is the website that sponsors this podcast, please go to CatholicCulture.org. We've got news, we've got commentary, we've got liturgical year information, we've got a big library of Catholic documents, church fathers, papal encyclicals, all sorts of out-of-print articles, and even some books. So yeah, check all that out. Subscribe to one of our newsletters, perhaps, and you can get, every day email for what the saint of the day is and different traditions from different Catholic cultures for celebrating that feast. All right, everybody, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.